Good evening. I'm Sue Glenn, the chairwoman of the Board of Education. I'm going to call the meeting to order now. Will you please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? Thank you. Just a couple of housekeeping items, Mrs. Griffin. You could note that we have some board members who are ill or not able to be here. Dr. Goldsworthy, Mr. Sadi, and Mr. Vaselli are absent this evening. And I would like everybody please to put your phones on vibrate so they're not disrupting the presentation. Then I also want to apologize for the fact that the board is sitting with our backs towards you. We don't typically like to do that, but the setup of this room, we need to be able to see the screen as well, so this was our only alternative. And I just wanted to go over the purpose for tonight's meeting. Tonight's meeting is a board workshop for board members to view and discuss the preliminary boundary options for our 8 elementary schools. As you may recall, redistricting to alleviate imbalances that currently occur across the district is part of the reconfiguration plan that was adopted by the board last fall. As has been announced, there will be 2 follow-up workshops scheduled. Next Tuesday, the 17th, we'll be here at Jonathan Law High School again at 7 p.m. And on Monday, the 23rd, at 7 p.m. at City Hall, will be our regular monthly Committee of the Whole meeting, which will be dedicated to redistricting. And we will welcome public comment at those subsequent meetings. Also at those meetings, the board and the consultants will discuss transition planning and kindergarten registration. Just to quickly let you know, kindergarten registration will be done generically and centrally this year at Parsons Complex. I believe towards the end of March is the target date, but specifics will be coming out on that shortly. And for tonight, we do have index cards available. If you want to jot down comments or questions that you might have, there'll be somebody at the end of the meeting to collect them at the back of the auditorium on your way out. There will also be an email address displayed at the end of the presentation where you can email questions and comments. In my Lonevic room, our consultant will work with administration to put a Q&A up on our website. With that said, let me introduce Mike Zupa and Rebecca Auger, our consultants from my Lonevic room.
Just a quick rundown on what we're going to cover tonight, and just to make sure everyone's aware that no decisions on any district boundaries are going to be made tonight. This is just an update for the board on where we stand in the process. We're going to review the Board of Ed's redistricting criteria, which were generated in the fall, talk about the standard programming room deployment, and our process for how we've arrived at the top 3 redistricting scenarios that we have to date, and then a little bit more on the next steps. So just to review, these are the Board of Ed priority redistricting criteria that the board adopted in November. And I'll just quickly go through them. The first is adhering to natural boundaries and trying to keep neighborhoods together. Second is balancing enrollments to ensure parity in available resources. The third is to minimize student travel time and transportation costs. Fourth, mitigating impact on students that have already been redistricted and remaining cognizant of and sensitive to those families. And avoiding unequal distribution of the redistricting burden. There's a realization that not all of these are likely to be achieved, that it will be a challenge to try to mesh all of these criteria, but these are what are guiding the process of drawing district boundaries. Just to touch on what balancing enrollments to ensure parity in resources really means, keep in mind that through this redistricting process has no intention of changing the physical structures of the elementary buildings, that we're working with the buildings as they are and just changing how they're utilized. And keeping that in mind, we all have to remain cognizant of the disparity in size between your buildings. So if you take a look at the table up on the screen, just comparing Mathewson, one of the larger buildings, to Pumpkin Delight, one of the smaller buildings, there's an 8,000 square foot difference between the 2 buildings. There's a difference of 10 full-size classrooms between the 2 buildings. Your media centers, your multi-purpose rooms are quite different. So we need to keep in mind that all schools cannot have the same number of students in them and have them fit comfortably. So balancing enrollments does not necessarily mean every school will have 450 students. It means balancing so that there's parity in the resources available to your students in all of your schools. And we also need to keep in mind that centers of population change over time in all cities, and they have, of course, in Milford, and that most of your elementary schools were built in the 50s and 60s, and the centers of population have changed since then. So actually drawing the district boundaries is important, and it makes big differences, and you'll see how that comes into play as we go through some of the options. Again, the parity in resources and program enhancement component of this reconfiguration is in the fact that there's a plan for increasing pre-K classrooms over time, in enhancing programming in that there will be a better balance of rooms among all of your schools to ensure that each school can offer similar programming. So the goal is to provide 9 full-size classrooms in each building over time to ensure that the list of programs that you see on the screen are available in each room. That's your art, your music, your science, your computer classrooms, your resource rooms, and then having the space for additional programs such as your band, your strings, your OTPT, enrichment, those kinds of programming. So to touch on the process for how we've arrived at where we are today, we, the consultants, worked with the administration to come up with locations for pre-K classrooms and your special ed self-contained programming rooms. And then we took a look at the 9 programming rooms that we just discussed for the art, the music, the computers, those programs. And we reserved 9 rooms per building for those standard program deployment rooms, the pre-K and the special ed. When we took a look at just the available resources in the district, there are 224 full-size classrooms in your elementary schools across the district. We're reserving 90 of those to meet that standard programming deployment, the pre-K and the special ed needs. That leaves 134 for grade level instruction rooms, in other words, K through 5 classrooms. That's operating at 90% efficiency if we could achieve that, which is quite high. And so we knew it was going to be a challenge. But we went ahead and we came up with 3 redistricting options to test them out under these parameters. And we found that we could not fit into all of the buildings under these parameters with the districts we drew, and we didn't think that any districts that we drew would fit under these parameters. And it's partially due to the fact that there's a great loss of economy of scale when you go back to the configuration of K-5 in smaller groupings. When you're paired at the K2, 3, 5, there's much less wobble between your grade cohorts. You just have bigger grade groupings. Your section breaks are easier to make, so the number of classrooms needed for second grade is easier. There's a greater economy there when you have a larger group to work with. So when we found that we couldn't achieve any district really under the parameters that we initially started off with, we went back to the administration and we worked to revise our standard room deployment a little bit. Still, the goal is reaching the 9 standard program rooms per building over time, but realizing that we probably need to start with 7 per building and phase in the additional 2. And then we also took another look at the preferred placement for pre-K and the special ed program rooms, and those are still things that we might revise again. But working with the administration, we're really trying to ensure that they're in appropriate locations, that their physical locations are appropriate, that they serve the city well geographically, and that it's providing even services across the city. So to give you a view of what we're working with for space parameters and what we're working with as an assumed capacity for each school based on the number of classrooms. Here's the list of the 8 elementary schools. You can see the full-size classrooms in the far left column. And again, there's large disparity here between your smaller schools of Pumpkin Delight and Live Oaks and your larger schools at Orange Ave and Mathewson. You can see in the next column we reserve 7 rooms off the top for each building. Those are those standard program rooms, the art, the music, computers, etc. You can see where we have, for now, located special ed self-contained program rooms and the pre-K classrooms in the next two columns. And what remains is the grade level instructional rooms, in other words, your K through 5 classrooms. Based on that K through 5 classroom number, we developed a capacity. And you can see the capacities vary from about 350 students at Pumpkin Delight and Live Oaks, all the way up to 500 students at Matthews. So working with those parameters that you just saw on that table, they gave us a lot more flexibility when it came to actually drawing the geographic boundaries. Our grade level instructional rooms total went from 134 to 150, so we gained 16 classrooms to locate K through 5. And then adjusting that the pre-K and the special ed classrooms also gave us greater flexibility in across geographic sections of the city. We retested those initial 3 options that we had come up with, and then we developed another 5 to review with the administration. And it's an iterative process. Each option sort of leads us to another option, and it takes several options to finally start to hone in on something that looks appropriate. Every option gets test fit against that redistricting criteria that we went over that the board adopted, and then we project enrollments based on the geographic boundaries that we've drawn to make sure that over time we're meeting those criteria, and over time we might be able to add and phase in those additional standard program deployment rooms. So those first 3 options that we went through, even under the new parameters, we still weren't able to balance enrollments to ensure that they were really evenly deployed programming rooms across all 8 schools. So there were insufficient grade level rooms in each building. We determined that those 3 options then just weren't viable because we weren't hitting the mark of ensuring balancing enrollments and resources. We generated another couple of options 4 and 5. They were both better able to serve the district in deploying the programming rooms and having the right class sizes for your K through 5 cohorts, but there were some bubbles that were difficult to overcome. Just unusually large class of second graders, say in a district for some reason. Option 4 worked at best, but it definitely needed modifications. Option 5 had a lot of concerns over student travel time and not having really adhered well to natural boundaries, so we just eliminated it from consideration. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike to take you through the top 3 options that we have so far.
Thanks, Rebecca. As Rebecca mentioned earlier in the presentation, it really is an iterative process. As we began working with option 4 and realizing that we now had sufficient space for the deployment options, especially for the 7 specials, as well as pre-K programs and district-wide special ed were in sufficient locations. We began to then tweak those boundaries, making small adjustments. Just to orient everybody, we're going to go through a series of maps. I am not going to go street by street for 3 options tonight. I don't want to keep everybody here till midnight, but I want to let everybody know that we have a half dozen of the maps recently posted just outside the auditorium, complete with street names and looking at the different options, so you'd be able to find your neighborhood on there and see under the different options what impact it would have, as well as immediately following the presentation tonight, the PowerPoint will be posted online with clear areas of change identified, as well as street names where you can then be able to browse through those and see exactly whether or not you're in one of the areas that are changing or if you're remaining in place at your elementary school. You can see on the map itself, we have a series of yellow outlines, and those yellow outlines represent the existing pairing of the elementary schools. To the left is District 1 right now, and that really encompasses JFK and Pumpkin Delight. In the middle, we have Matthewson and Meadowside. In the center, we have Orange Ave and Cap Pen Meadow, then Live Oaks and the Orchard Ave to the right. For each of the maps, we maintain the same color coding so you can be able to orient yourself a little better with Pumpkin Delight in red, JFK in orange, Mathewson in the purple color, Meadowside in the blue color, or actually Mathewson in the blue color, Meadowside in the purple color, Captain Meadow in green, Orange Ave in orange, Live Oaks in pink, and Orchard in yellow. As Rebecca mentioned, it was very important to be able to adhere to the class size. And what we use for our class size parameters is for K through second was not to exceed 20, and for above, it was not to exceed 24. We use those as really hard and fast guidelines, ensuring that class size was a very important factor. What we did was we tested them based on redistributing the students who are currently in the school system. As Rebecca mentioned, this option allowed us to have 150 classrooms available for use. Our need under the current enrollment was 139. The important number is next year, where we have a need under this option of 140. Looking at the 150 really gets into why when we started at 134, it just wasn't feasible yet. But as we're well aware, there is an enrollment decline occurring, so having that ability to phase in through a natural progression will work in this case. This is taking a look at the larger picture out a number of years, out to actually 2019. Looking back now at the number that we had originally tested, where we required 134 classrooms we would have available to us under 9 programmatic rooms. At that time, under this option, we're estimating 132 classrooms would be of need. However, it's one of those situations where the enrollment changes based on the changing demographics of the neighborhoods. So that's why we have those district-wide programs as well as the pre-K to ensure full deployment and maybe an option following the enrollment numbers as time goes on and being able to make adjustments to where those program locations are, ensuring that it's still equitable, still going to serve the district, but allow a much smoother phase-in at that point in time. That's when we look at the earliest of being able to go into the 9 specials. Taking a look at the detailed views of each, and now these will be provided online to be able to see at the neighborhood level. I'm not going to go street by street on this, but you can see JFK is roughly bound by Route 1, separating that area then from Meadowside. Milford Point Road is largely the dividing line there. And working our way into the detailed view of sort of the central portion. We brought Calfpen Meadow over and it really splits the middle of town with Orange Ave. And then looking at preparing for Orchard Hills as well as Live Oaks. As part of our analysis, we were not looking at redistricting the middle, but we wanted to see what the impact would be at the middle school, understanding that that feeder there is set. What you're going to see on this map is the green outlines of the current middle school attendance zones. And you can see where we do have some splits in the pathways, in particular in Mathewson, splitting to West Shore as well as Calfpen, now splitting between Harborside and East Shore. What we'd like to draw your attention to is looking at not only the next year's 6th grade classes, but also sort of the future 6th grade classes that are going to be matriculating through the system. And that just to note that it's a rather small split in both cases of those. Looking at option B, we made a few small changes. Those changes really affect Mathewson, Meadowside, and Pumpkin Delight. What this did for us, for the current year, it pushed us up just a little bit, but for next year when it would be implemented in 15-16, we really are looking at the same numbers, still following the same parameters for our class sizes, ensuring fit, and then looking out towards the future to ensure that we have a good fit. I started taking a look at some of the numbers. Rebecca mentioned earlier about looking at how you're efficiently using the building from just a total student standpoint. You begin looking at all of your buildings as a whole from a room use by use, which gives a pretty good indicator. And looking ahead, even out towards 2019-20, we're looking at an 88% efficiency based on a room basis. Typically, you would strive for about 85, so it is a very high use of your instructional room space throughout the district for this option. Looking at the detailed areas of change, we made a couple slight tweaks on here. One of those is an area from Mathewson over to from Meadowside over to JFK. It's really bound by I-95 and Route 1 right here on Lansdale where we're at, coming down Lansdale Street. That was a small tweak, as well as two neighborhoods along Milford Point Road. We made changes there also. This is just from 4A to 4B to see what that impact would be. There's been no change to the central part of the 4B redistricting plan, nor of the eastern part of the redistricting plan. Those tweaks were done to counter some bubbles. Overall, they didn't make a tremendous impact on the overall efficiency looking across the board, but it was really just to ensure that we weren't having bubbles coming through in the next few years that were going to be taxing to the class sizes of those schools. Not much change either on the split pathways, but we wanted to draw some attention to it. We're still looking at the Mathewson split, a fairly small number, and the Cap Penn split, slightly over a classroom there. Working our way through option 4C, this now incorporated the changes from 4B and evolved into 4C, where we have some slight tweaks impacting Cap Penn, Orange Ave, as well as Orchard Hills. With this option, we definitely had an increase in efficiency in that. You'll remember on the two prior options, we were about 140 for the total classroom need, which is indicative of staffing. Under this option, that number dropped to about 137, which is a slightly less use of space, but a slightly more economical use of staff under this option. How it fared out through the life of the projection, we're looking at the same number of 132 out to 1920. So ultimately, those tweaks ended up balancing out the staffing need a number of years down the road. On the west side of town, there was no change from 4B. On the central part of town, there was a change around Housatonic and Peck in that neighborhood. That's an area that went prior in Cap Penn Meadow, and option B is now in orange, as well as Point Beach. We saw a small change there where it went from Orchard to Cap Penn Meadow. No change on the east side of town for option C. What it did was it reduced the number for Cap Penn split between East Shore and Harborside, but it's looking at about 24 students over the next few years that would be split off that pathway. Based on our look at the impact it had in the overall redistricting, one of the items we wanted to bring to the board's attention would be for consideration of the middle school boundaries and looking at the small number of students each year that would be broken out from their peer groups. I know as part of the long-range planning committee process, that was one of the very important outcomes or recommendations, and we felt that it was important to bring that to light and exactly what the impact would be. It does not change the number at all of the total number of students that would be in each middle school. All it's changing is where they're originating from, what elementary school they are going to be assigned to, and how that impacts their peer group as it moves through their experience at Milford Public Schools. Looking at our next steps, we have the maps posted outside. We'd like to have for everybody the opportunity to go out, spend as much time as you want to be able to take a look at those. They'll be posted on the website. We know there's a lot of information in this package as well as on the maps, and we try to get through it in as quick and comprehensive process as possible, but we understand it'll take some time for everyone to be able to distill that and get an understanding of what it means. So what we're doing is we're going to be fielding public comments and feedback through The email address provided for the redistricting by Milford Public Schools, that can be sent directly through. We'll be able to group those questions, be able to answer them and get those updated as part of an FAQ. Those will also be passed out and addressed at the February 17th meeting. At this meeting will be an opportunity for the public to now comment on the redistricting plan, as well as to be able to listen to the presentation on the next key part of it, which is really the transition plan. What we're discussing tonight and going to have a dialogue with the board is solely about the mechanism of redistricting. It's not getting into how it's actually going to be implemented, all of the staffing, all of the necessary transportation planning that needs to go behind that. That will be touched on at the next meeting. We're looking at a meeting on the 23rd too for the committee of the whole to be able to have a dialogue with the Board of Ed on that. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to the Board of Ed. If they have any questions for us or comments, we'd be glad to address those.
Okay, board members, who wants to go first? Need a few minutes to digest the information. Mr. Wiskman.
One of the considerations that is occurring at this point in time is a number of proposals to build additional substantial buildings under the 830G mechanism, which the city isn't in favor of, but which may come into play anyway. For example, 257-unit apartment building being proposed to the Devon area. And my question to you is, to what extent is it possible to bring into consideration known and likely additional buildings that might come into play in the very near future?
Having followed some of the news local in the paper, I know what you're speaking of. What we always like to do, and I don't think it's been released yet, get an understanding of the units that are there, what the split, and I don't know if it's been done yet by the city planning department. If they calculated a potential school-age child yield for that, it's typically what would be done as part of a development of that nature. It would be great if you're able to get that information. You don't want to have an entire redistricting plan or any facility plan hinged on that, but you want to be cognizant of it. I think the way we've handled it, because I do know the area in which you speak and where it would be in our different options. It's in our centrally located schools that would allow us some ability to shift some programs around, as well as the school that has some district-wide programming in it. If it were to come to fruition, there would be an adjustment made. Development's going to happen. I was of the understanding that there was still a moratorium on affordable housing in Milford that started last year, but that may not be the case.
The moratorium has been lifted at this point, and I believe for the Big Drive complex, which I think Mr. Wiskman is speaking of, my understanding is that the majority of the units are studio and one bedroom.
From our experience with this, especially, we've done some multiplier work where we've taken a look at some of the different housing throughout the area. Those in particular have very small yields. When you get into the 2 and 3 bedroom, especially ones that may be owner occupied, if there's certain types, you can get a much higher yield than a typical rental. It's something that we'll give a call to the planning department, get that information, and be able to see exactly of that number, what the split is, and we could apply some multipliers to be able to see what the impact is. But the hard part about it is, by the time it ultimately gets planned, approved, you know that typically you get a certain number of students, but it's always hard to pinpoint, to adjust your projections or to adjust your planning, because you don't know what grade they're going to be and what timing they're going to come in at. But I think once we get a handle on it, if we need to make an adjustment to ensure that we don't have to redistrict again, it's not going to overcrowd the school, that's definitely something we'll look at and get back to you at the next meeting on.
Other questions? Federico?
questions. We've been talking for a while as a board about this imbalance in the student population where it's been higher on the west side of town than on the east side of town. And I know you spent some time studying that when you were working with the committee last year as well. I wanted to get an understanding of what your impression is of the reasons for that imbalance. Do you think it's temporary and cyclical, or do you think it's more permanent? Perhaps the closing of Simon Lake playing a factor in that? I just want to understand if it's more temporary or permanent.
I wouldn't use the term temporary or permanent. I think it's really a function of the housing stock that's available there. I think what we see in a lot of communities is areas now, since the recession, that have a larger percentage of rental stock, that those are staving off the enrollment decline a little better. It's not that it's growing, it's just that it's being much more stable. And areas, especially individual schools that are fed largely by single-family housing, those are the ones that have seemed to have the greatest decline. So some areas in town have much less, say, either affordable housing or rental housing. Those areas in town are in a little bit of a steeper decline versus the areas that are having a larger percentage of that type of housing. Whether or not it's going to be a permanent condition, probably 10, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, we were most concerned about the areas with single-family neighborhoods and typical subdivisions as generating children, and that's not really the case right now. I think it's dynamic. I think it changes over time. I think that's why you go through a redistricting. It's not because you want to. It's because your enrollment either doesn't fit where the schools are. As Rebecca mentioned, they were developed in the 50s and 60s where it was a much different housing situation than it is today. I think, not to make a recommendation, but advice is that you look at zoning, you look at development, you look at everything that goes into contributing to housing in town, as well as generating children, and those all are dynamic and changing. Yet we view boundaries as something that needs to be static, because the school was always drawn from this area. To have best use of your facilities, you need to look at the two as if they're both have the ability to change to ensure that you're being efficient as well as educating to the best of the ability of the facilities that you have.
Okay. So do you think we could see a situation where in 10 to 15 years it reverses? I'm sorry, I know.
That's a crystal ball question. It's one of those ones where if I was able to probably see that, I wouldn't be redistricting schools. But I think it's one of those things where the board, and you guys are fortunate here in that you have a strong planning department, and you're looking at the school side and understanding what's happening from the planning side of things to be able to have that line of communication to understand, are there talks of development coming, and are we investing in schools in the right spot, and not having insight into not only when the development is about to occur, but where the development pressures are, really helps guide what you're doing with your buildings. Before you invest, take a look at that. That's kind of some words of wisdom. We don't see it often, but we sort of preach it to a lot of communities, saying that we all need to be cognizant of that, especially when you have the ability within the departments to share that kind of information. I think that's key in best using tax dollars moving forward.
Okay, thanks. I have another question. Within the options that we've seen, are there, particularly the 4A, B, and C, are there any situations where there are students who could be walkers, but they are being bused to a different school?
Some of the changes you saw in options 4B and 4C were to try to address that. I think especially for B, the changes in Matthews and Meadowside, JFK and Pumpkin Delight were to try to ensure that Meadowside maintained walkers. So the differences here between 4A and 4B, you can see we maintained that area because we assumed they could walk. And then we brought JFK down as well. So there could be situations, pardon me, just because of the close proximity of those schools, especially Meadowside and Pumpkin Delight, but we did try to the best of our ability to maintain walkers as walkers.
Can I ask while you're on that screen, so that little
Sorry.
jog that goes down from JFK into the Meadowside, I think, it seems to kind of dissect the Meadowside district in half. And I'm wondering, it doesn't even seem to be that there's any streets or anything there, so I'm wondering what that, and I might just not be able to see them because there's existing streets, but.
No, I can answer that. We had a lot on Lansdale that actually connected in with Route 1, so we were trying to keep the addresses in line where we didn't have sort of one hanging address on a given street. That's something that we envision being able to clean up so it's a little more contiguous. It would just happen to be a function of the size of the lots and the shape of the lots.
Okay.
We didn't want to split any lots, so we ended up with that little bit of an oddity. It's one of those little adjustments. I don't believe there would be any students impacted. It would just be for the cleanliness of the boundaries.
Other questions? Mr. DeRosa?
Yes, I have a question. Now, the three options, excuse me, 4A, B, and C, is there one that you're leaning more towards that's going to fit our needs? That you can, if you have throws dart in the wall, which one to land closest to? And I'm not asking you to, commit to anything. I'm just asking you, where is the discussion most? I mean, 'cause you had to have a reason why to come up with two more options. So what led you to do that? And, is there an option there that you're leaning more towards?
Well, I think as you can see, options 4A, 4B, and 4C all built upon each other. So we had started with option 4, which we knew needed changes. We made those changes to arrive at 4A. It looked okay, but there were some tweaks that we wanted to make. One, to try to address the walking issue where we had students very close to Meadowside going to Mathewson. And we didn't feel that that was meeting your criteria, so we made some tweaks around there. And then that's 4B. 4C made some additional tweaks where we felt Cafe Meadow was extending a little too far west for comfort for transportation issues. And then Point Beach just didn't seem necessary to bring into Orchard Hills. So because they all sort of built upon each other, I guess option 4C is the end point right now, so I'm making those small tweaks.
Yeah, while we were going through and looking at the logical nature of the boundaries in the neighborhoods, we were also realizing as we began adding areas and subtracting areas that geography really, really does matter greatly here. And we realized that especially for next year, looking at 4C, we had a little more flexibility in space. The requirement for classrooms came down a little bit. We gained a little efficiency on the number of staff that would be part of that. So that was also one of our considerations while we were still able to maintain parity across the board and still employ all the programs. So it all kind of went hand in hand.
So when you make that comment, is that due to, and I know you speak to Dr. Feeser and Mr. Cummings, probably had these conversations, is that due to resignations in the administration, or is that due to projected decrease in enrollment that caused that fluctuation? You need those to come up with that solution?
No, what that was due to was the kids are packaged, lack of a better term, they're packaged differently in neighborhoods. And by adhering to the class size, some neighborhoods have slightly more students in specific grades, and they may have more or less birds. It was just being able to gain some efficiency by changing slight street boundaries while still adhering to everything else. It had nothing to do with any staffing concerns. It's just the number we're presenting is basically a need. And that need doesn't take into consideration fluctuations that may occur where you would want to have, a built-in cushion for it. It's just saying that if the numbers don't change from where they're at and where we're projecting them, best case you're going to have this 137 would be your need for next year. Realizing that if you have a student in a given grade pushes the threshold over, you would be at 138. So it was really just an economy there.
And just one last question. When you say revise on page 8, I'm referenced back with the pre-K. I know that one of our requests to have pre-K in at least 3 facilities is just telling me that looking at option 4C that these 4 facilities will have pre-K in them, or is that open to change also going forward? Because that's more.
For options 4A, 4B, and 4C, we are operating under the assumption that pre-K is in 4 buildings. Again, that is something that may be fine-tuned. But for now, working with the administration, this is where we landed to generate those options.
It's not that I'm complaining about it, I just want to find out how you got there, because I know one of these, 3 would be the minimum requirements. Thank you. And one last question I have, and this might have been an oversight on my point. On page 15, you referenced 132 classrooms. You threw that number on. I couldn't find out where you tied the number of 132 classrooms.
It was a lack of my ability to see the screen, and it's actually 133.
Okay. I have to deal with something like that, because I'm having trouble seeing this page myself. So, thanks.
Other questions? Yes, Mrs. Federico?
I have one question for administration. We're talking about classrooms of 137 at some point in here. Would that equate to the number of classroom teachers, and how does that compare to what we have this year?
The number is, current number is 130. So the 137 on this or any of those other projections throughout the PowerPoint, according to the work that Ramon did, that is the number of regular ed classrooms K-5.
So then how would that affect the number of additional teachers needed for a K-5 configuration?
Well, depending on the initial year of the option you look at, the difference of whatever loan improvement projected is that number of classrooms minus 130. The thing that I would caution, as you look at this, is if you look at the class sizes, again by the parameters of we want board for years that K2 is 20 or under, 3-5 is 25 or under, preferably 24. There's a number of scenarios there that border on the need for an additional classroom. So it's just one of those things that as we move through the process and ultimately finalize the numbers, the final number will be very dependent on the final borders, the numbers that are collected.
So just so I understand this, when we were talking about the budget, we were talking about 16
Yes.
additional teachers. Am I missing something, or does this mean 7 if it all worked out?
If it all worked out, it would be 7. But I think, again, as you look through this, every one of them has enough scenarios that are questionable as to whether we would need additional teachers at quite a number of grades, particularly in the K2, or quite a number of situations.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it may not be as low as 7, but it also may not be as high as 16.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. One of my next questions was there's an awful lot of data here, and I don't know if there's a way to do this practically, but I would be interested in seeing as much as possible the average class size and percent of efficiency for some of these scenarios. I don't know how you would do it because there is so much data. So, however you think that makes sense, if we can get that information, I think it would be helpful.
Okay, we'll provide that at the meeting on the 17th and be able to sort of walk through it to provide an explanation before we just put it out there.
Okay, sure.
Other questions? I had one question I wanted to ask. Looking at just the maps in general, it's kind of an eye-opener when you see where the physical buildings are actually located. How much of a role did the physical location of the buildings play in this process? But, I expect it might have made this process quite challenging.
Yeah, it certainly did add to the challenge, especially on the western side of the city where you have, Meadowside and Pumpkin Delight. There's a fair number of students could be walkers to either school, and yet you're sort of trying to shift population towards the east, towards eastern schools. So it did pose quite a challenge. Even Mathewson and Orange Ave, they're just in such close proximity. Making those boundaries it's difficult. So yeah, it certainly added to the challenge.
It'd be nice if we could just pick the building up and move them.
Yes, it would.
Are there other questions? Yes, Ms. Federico?
Is there anything else you could tell us just about your rationale behind some of the options? What kind of drove the first three and then the ones that followed?
I think when as Rebecca mentioned, it's iterative, and we learn lessons on each of the first three on what worked and what didn't work from a fit for the building standpoint. We thought in options 1 and 2 that we were only being constrained because we had 134 grade level instructional rooms to use, but then we gained 16 additional rooms and still couldn't make it work. And realizing that the dynamics and the enrollment of each neighborhood really are critical to that, and that in addition to where the buildings are sort of began to refine where we were going. We dealt with a lot of communities that have buildings of older vintage, and we did a fairly significant redistricting in Bristol, where we had a lot of buildings that were on one side of town, and that they were there since the 1950s and 60s, when that older neighborhood was booming and teeming with children. However, development changed, subdivision and sprawl, and it warranted, being able to elongate the districts, and we really wanted to avoid that here. We really wanted to strive for that compact nature, adhering to the different boundaries. You have hard boundaries in town. The highway, Route 1, the Merritt Parkway, water courses, a lot of things going on that really governed what we did. So as we began to really dig into it, all those criteria themselves began to really limit what we could do. You would think that you have a world of possibilities going in to create boundaries, but when you apply the criteria and look at the enrollment in each area, it really does begin to focus where you're at and provide you with great direction in knowing what works and what doesn't work, just through trial and error.
Okay. I'm sorry, as I look at I have one more question. Is everything built on that 7 program room all the way through, what's the last, 2019 to 2020? Everything is built on 7?
Yeah, it is. And you remember from the first test on the 9 program room, we had an availability of about 134. And you can look out across all of our options, particularly 4A, 4B, 4C. We're just to the south of that in 1920. So we think that is probably the key point in time. Provided you were going to be able to make some slight adjustments to those pre-K or district-wide special ed programs to be able to now have implementation of the 9, if all the stars align.
Yeah, I was wondering, as we get further out, if there's a way, when you give us additional data, if there's also a way you could show us how close we are to 9 as we get to the 1920 per school.
Yeah, I think if you're looking at a global deployment, that's the first year you'd be able to do it. I think it would be a Board of Ed decision if you wanted to utilize those classrooms from year to year as you begin to free up space for additional programmatic rooms. Obviously, you're not going to leave them empty, put a sign on the door that says vacant, you're going to be able to use them. So some will then have an opportunity for others to be able to do that. The way we judged it was to be able to deploy it globally, really, rather than on a school-by-school basis.
Further questions or comments? Dr. Fieser, did you have anything you wanted to add yourself?
Yeah, I think my hope would be is that the public would understand the complexity of this process, evidenced in honoring the criteria that the board established for creating the different attendance areas, and secondly, in trying to in recognizing that the buildings themselves are not equal in size, and therefore, you know, there's the challenge that comes with that. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is to understand the complexity from the perspective of, for those people who were involved 6 years ago when that redistricting occurred. It was certainly difficult, but it involved pairing 2 schools, and so you had 4 pairings, whereas this is not schools being paired, this is 8 individual attendance areas, which again, there's the greater complexity. And the final thing is that people understand that idea of economy of scale. So when you take, my simplest example is when you take 400 students, for example, in grade 3 and have them in 4 buildings, that's 100 students per building. That's 20 kids, 5 classes, 20 kids in a class. If you take those same 400 students and you divide them into 8 buildings, you then have 50 students. Well, 50 students, according to our class size, immediately requires 3 classrooms, regardless of whether it's most likely a 5th grade or if it's a 3rd grade. And so that's where you have those additional needs for teachers. I'm not saying one is better than the other, I'm just simply saying is that there's just more complexity with this process. And that hopefully people will understand why there are so many different options and, you know, as you indicated, iterations, because you're constantly trying to move the boundaries to see what best, again, fit the criteria that the board had established, and quite frankly, what best serves students, all students from pre-K through 5.
Thank you, Dr. Fieser. Any other questions or comments? Okay, then, seeing none, we'll just remind the board and the public that we will meet again on the 17th here at Jonathan Law High School at 7 p.m. To talk about some next steps and to answer some of the questions that have been posed and fine-tune whatever needs to be fine-tuned. With that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second? Mr. DeRosa, second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.